killed for their faith. A synagogue shooting leaves 11 dead. The Pittsburgh community grieves and the world reacts. We talked to the rabbi who led the vigil. The final Synod document, a month-long meeting focused on young people, wraps up at the Vatican. We're in Rome with a summary and analysis of the bishop's conclusions. Tragedy in Indonesia. A plane crashes into the sea minutes after takeoff. Investigators are now trying to determine what went wrong. And the fight for religious freedom. The U.S. Attorney General talks about the importance of faith around the world. On EWTN News Nightly for Monday, October 29th, 2018. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you to those of you joining us from around the world for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Lauren Ashburn. They were parents, grandparents, brothers, husbands, and wives. The one thing they had in common, their Jewish faith. That is what brought them to the Tree of Life Synagogue Saturday morning, where they lost their lives in the deadliest attack on Jews in American history. Today, the suspect arrived in court in a wheelchair, and the White House says the President and First Lady will visit Pittsburgh tomorrow.
What happened yesterday will not break us. It will not ruin us. We will continue to thrive and sing and worship and learn together.
That was the message leaders had Sunday during a vigil remembering the 11 people killed. It happened at the Tree of Life Synagogue Saturday. Less than 2 miles from the scene of the massacre, crowds spilled out of the memorial hall. Rabbis from the Tree of Life Synagogue led the interfaith vigil.
And continue our historic legacy in this city with the friendliest people that we know.
Authorities say the alleged shooter expressed hatred toward Jews during the rampage and after. He faces 29 federal charges, and the U.S. Attorney in Pittsburgh says he will seek the death penalty.
The fact that this attack took place during a worship service makes it even more heinous. A place of worship is a sacred place.
Tutti in realtà siamo feriti da questo disumano atto di violenza.
Pope Francis is grieving with Pittsburgh's Jewish community following Saturday's shooting. During yesterday's Angelus, the Holy Father called the massacre an inhumane act of violence and prayed for an end to hatred. Pope Francis isn't the only world leader reacting to the shooting. Correspondent Wyatt Goolsby joins us with more from the State Department. Good evening, Wyatt.
Good evening, Lauren. Heads of state and high-ranking diplomats are offering their condolences tonight. The mass shooting had spurred people of faith around the world to come together in prayer.
About 100 people gathering for a vigil last night in front of the American Embassy in Paris, one day after the mass shooting in Pittsburgh. People of faith, including young people, coming together to light candles and pay their respects to the victims.
We believe that when American Jews, when French Jews are targeted because they are Jews, it's a matter for all the citizens. And that's why we are here today, to show our support to the grieving family.
In Tel Aviv, another show of support. The colors of the U.S. and Israeli flags alternating. Similar signs in Jerusalem, where the flags are projected on the old city walls, saying, "We are with you, Pittsburgh." The Israeli cabinet, led by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, opened its weekly meeting by observing a minute of silence for the victims of the Pittsburgh killing, Netanyahu telling Americans he was heartbroken and appalled by the attack.
We stand together with the American people in the face of this horrendous anti-Semitic brutality, and we all pray for the speedy recovery of the wounded.
World leaders also issuing statements over the weekend. Canada's Prime Minister tweeting, "Canadians' hearts are with the Jewish community in Pittsburgh today as they endured a horrific anti-Semitic attack while at prayer. May the families of those murdered be comforted, and may the injured recover quickly and fully." German Chancellor Angela Merkel saying, "My sympathies are for the families. I wish for strength and recovery for the victims. We all must stand resolutely against anti-Semitism everywhere."
The United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres adding to that, saying anti-Semitism is menace to democratic values and peace. There are also strong feelings about the attack here as well. The outgoing U.S. ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, is saying an attack on the most sacred of places is the cruelest and most cowardly act a person can do. Lauren?
Correspondent White Goolsby reporting from the State Department. President Trump and the First Lady are visiting Pennsylvania tomorrow in the wake of this shooting. President Trump calls the tragedy an evil anti-Semitic attack and an assault on humanity. The president believes an armed guard could have stopped the killer, and he's fighting for the death penalty. White House correspondent Mark Irons reports. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Lauren. Soon after the attack, President Trump said the death penalty should be brought back in vogue. I asked a top Catholic official in the White House about that today, but the president is also calling for prayers for those who perished and their loved ones, as he calls for unity to conquer hate.
We must stand with our Jewish brothers and sisters to defeat anti-Semitism. This wicked act of mass murder is pure evil.
President Trump speaking at two pre-planned events this weekend after the assault in Pittsburgh. In Indiana, he asked for a Jewish rabbi to begin with prayer. The president condemned the violence and gave a stiff warning to anyone who would attack Jews.
There must be no tolerance for anti-Semitism in America or for any form of religious or racial hatred or prejudice.
The president condemned the violence and gave a stiff warning to anyone who would attack Jews.
Those seeking their destruction, we will seek their destruction.
And soon after hearing of the tragedy in Pittsburgh, the president renewed his call for capital punishment.
When people do this, they should get the death penalty, and they shouldn't have to wait years and years.
His position doesn't align with the church's stance. Following on teaching from Pope Benedict and St. John Paul II, Pope Francis approved an update to the Catholic Catechism earlier this year. It reads, "The death penalty is inadmissible because it is an attack on the inviolability and dignity of the person." I asked Mercedes Schlapp, a Catholic and White House senior official, to weigh in.
I know the president's condemning the violence, but as a Catholic, are you concerned that he's calling for the death penalty for the Pittsburgh suspect?
They're in the process of the investigation. We'll see what the judges rule.
But is it appropriate to be calling for the death penalty?
I don't think that's for the judges to make that decision, and obviously that's a state issue.
The American flag on top of the White House here behind me has been lowered to fly at half staff. We will report from Pittsburgh tomorrow as the President and First Lady travel there to meet with victims' families. Lauren?
White House correspondent Mark Irons. Thank you, Mark. Joining me now by Skype from Indianapolis is Rabbi Benjamin Sendro of Congregation Sharai Tefillah. Rabbi Sendro was invited by President Trump this weekend to offer a prayer for the victims of the attack in Pittsburgh. Rabbi Sendro, welcome to our program.
Thank you for having me. I wish it was under better circumstances.
Me too. In your prayer you delivered this weekend at the president's request, you asked people to remember that the presence of a few evil people among us does not define this country. Yet nearly 2,000 anti-Semitic incidents were reported nationwide last year, a 57% spike from the year before. And this spring, your own synagogue was affected. A vandal painted Nazi flags?
A Nazi flag and iron crosses, correct.
Why do you think we are seeing this level of anti-Semitism?
I think it's part of a broader problem. I think the further we stray from our Judeo-Christian values, the coarser and meaner and cruder our society becomes. As I said recently, I don't believe in a religious government, just like our founders didn't, but they believed in a religious society, and I believe in a religious society. And religious values don't divide us, they unite us. People of goodwill coming together is the best way to counter and combat this sort of evil.
In an open letter to President Trump, a group of Pittsburgh Jewish leaders under the auspices of Ben the Ark said President Trump is not welcome unless he fully denounces white nationalism. The letter also calls on him to, quote, stop targeting and endangering all minorities, cease your assault on immigrants and refugees. Rabbi, is this political point scoring?
Absolutely. Absolutely political point scoring. I'm embarrassed by it.
You are embarrassed by it? Why?
Because this should not be politicized. And the president took great pains to have me and to have a pastor with me to offer prayers before his speech before the future farmers of America. It was not a political rally. It was a speech he was scheduled to give to a field house full of young people to encourage them for their future.
We only have a few seconds left, but I really want to read this quote from then Pope John Paul II, who said more than 30 years ago in speaking about the connection between Christianity and Judaism, quote, "We have a relationship which we do not have with any other religion. You are our dearly beloved brothers, and in a certain way, you are our elder brothers." As people of faith, Rabbi, how can we work together to heal our nation?
We have to link arms, whether it's literally or figuratively. We have to understand that while we have some theological differences, which is fine, because if we didn't, we wouldn't need both religions, our values are virtually identical. And people of good faith condemn this sort of heinous act in the strongest possible terms. And that goes for Jews, Catholics, Protestants, even secular people. There are some wonderful secular people. I wish they had faith, but...
Well, you'll work on them, I'm sure. Rabbi Benjamin Sendro of Congregation Sharai Tefillah, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Pope Francis apologized to young people who feel ignored as he wrapped up a month-long synod meeting focused on their concern.
Scusateci se spesso non vi abbiamo dato ascolto.
The Holy Father made the apology during his homily at the closing Mass for Synod on Youth on Sunday. It brought together more than 260 cardinals, bishops, and priests for 4 weeks to discuss how the Church can reach the youth. Vatican correspondent Juliette Lindley joins us from a rainy Rome. Juliette, we have been following the Synod closely. The Synod Fathers released a final document over the weekend that summarizes their conclusions. Tell us the highlights.
Lauren, indeed, after nearly a month of discussions on how the Church can reach the younger generations, the bishop's bottom line was this: we need to get better at listening to you. So the document says the Church must find new ways of presenting its teaching on sexuality and continue to accompany and listen to people with same-sex attraction. Another topic that emerged as a theme is what's known as synodality, meaning walking together with the Church. The Synod's final report also touches on the role of women, formation of the conscience, and the use of technology. So it was a very wide-ranging document, Lauren, that delved into many issues facing youth today.
Some parts of that document are causing concern among some Catholics. What are they?
Lauren, a lot of Catholics would have liked to see a stronger response to the clergy sex abuse scandal. Now, while the issue was mentioned, critics say the bishops didn't ask for forgiveness. And another issue, Lauren, of concern was the ambiguous language on homosexuality. The hot-button issue of LGBT wasn't dealt with per se, which pleased many concerned about a push to normalize homosexual relations in the Church. But there was the reaffirmation of a commitment against all sexually based discrimination and violence. And the section on women in the Church also drew some criticism. That's because the Vatican said the document gives greater recognition to the role of women, including in decision making. But it did not get specific, Lauren. A small number of women, as we know, were involved in this synod, but they weren't allowed to vote on the final document. And Pope Francis has already ruled out women's ordination.
What happens next? What do bishops do with this document?
Well, bishops will be waiting to hear what the Holy Father has to say about the final report. The Pope usually considers the conclusions and then writes an apostolic exhortation. Now, that's a document that encourages people to undertake a certain activity. Now, in September, Pope Francis changed synod rules. He might not publish an exhortation at all, but will use the final report as his exhortation itself. So, for the moment, we're waiting to hear from the Vatican whether he will do that. And one thing is for sure, Pope Francis was very engaged during this synod. He listened, he took notes, he was very present, and people noted that very much, Lauren.
Thank you so much, Juliet Lindley, EWTN News Nightly Vatican correspondent.
Thank you, Lauren.
Rescuers are searching the sea near Jakarta, Indonesia, after a passenger plane crashed minutes after takeoff. Lion Air flight ytsync-en was on a short flight when it disappeared from radar. The plane was carrying 189 people, including a child and 2 infants. All are believed dead. The Vatican says Pope Francis is praying for those who died and for their families. German Chancellor Angela Merkel announced she will not seek re-election after her term ends in 2021. She is also stepping down later this year as the chairman of her party. Merkel, who's been chancellor since 2005, says she's done with politics. An American tourist from Louisiana helped stop a hammer-wielding thief who unsuccessfully tried to steal the Magna Carta. It happened at Salisbury Cathedral in England. The Magna Carta, which in 1215 established the principle that everyone, including the king, was subject to the law, was protected by 2 layers of thick glass and wasn't damaged. The almost thief was arrested and is free on bail. Coming up, we return to Rome with reaction to the Synod on Youth and the Pope's view on the clergy sex abuse scandal. As Pope Francis ended the Synod on Youth this weekend, he said the Catholic Church was being persecuted by accusations from the devil.
In questo momento ci sta accosando forte.
It was an apparent reference to claims that he covered up for a sexual predator that had thrown his papacy into turmoil. During the Synod, bishops addressed the clergy sex abuse scandal and people with same-sex attraction.
I think some of the Africans bishops simply said, hey, this is not a priority for us. Our people are hungry. Our people are being killed in wars. They're forced to immigrate. Our young people are being trafficked.
In the final document, the bishops urged more decision-making roles for women within the church, but they did not raise the issue of women's ordination. Edward Penton, Rome correspondent for EWTN's National Catholic Register, joins us. He's the author of a Register blog post, Youth Synod Final Document, 5 Areas of Concern. The most unpopular paragraph, Ed, in the document, with 65 Synod fathers voting against it, is on sexuality. Let's take a look. Section 150 speaks of a church commitment, quote, against all discrimination and violence on a sexual basis. Ed, why is this paragraph so controversial?
It's controversial, Lauren, because the Catechism states that it's not all discrimination, but unjust discrimination that's at issue here. And what people are concerned about is that, for example, if somebody might want to dismiss an employee who's guilty of sexual misdemeanors, they may not be allowed to on the basis of discrimination under this new passage in this document. And so that's causing some concern. But also, this paragraph is also a worry to some because it has rather ambiguous language, and it talks about deepening the anthropological study, a deepening of the anthropological study in the church of sexuality. And some people see that as a means of getting in an agenda which seeks to normalize homosexual relations in the church. So that's another concern as well.
We've been asking you over the weeks whether or not LGBT was in the document, final document. Was it?
No, it wasn't, but these other elements have gone in instead, and that's why I think people are concerned that they've sort of gone around, some in the Synod have gone around that and tried to get it in another way.
The final document says the church should give greater recognition to women, including in decision-making, Ed, but women delegates were not allowed to vote on the final document. Tell us what the final document says about women.
Yes, well, exactly that, Lauren. It talks about giving women a greater role at all ecclesial levels, a greater role in decision-making. It's quite interesting, though, that this wasn't actually, it didn't figure that highly in the Synod, but it has figured highly in the final document. And even in the draft document, it didn't figure that highly, but it did in the end. And so, again, that's an area of concern that people think it might be used as a means to either bring in women deacons, which is a controversial issue, or even further down the line to give give women priests, give the possibility rather of women priests in the church. So again, that's another concern.
And quickly, you said there were 5 concerns. Give us a little bit more on the rest of those concerns.
The sexual abuse was another issue. Some Synod fathers, especially in the United States, wanted that to figure more highly, and they were disappointed that it wasn't, because a lot of other Synod fathers didn't think it was so much of concern to them, because they're not affected so much by the crisis of sexual abuse. So that was another one. But there are good elements too in the document, and it's not. Although there are these concerns, I think people feel there's a lot good in there as well.
Thank you so much, Edward Penton, Rome correspondent for EWTN's National Catholic Register.
Thank you, Lauren.
Up next, the U.S. Attorney General on religious freedom and his reaction to the synagogue shooting. Plus, my thoughts on the importance of faith after another house of worship shooting. Back to our top story. The Attorney General condemns the synagogue shooting that left 11 dead, saying it is an attack on all people. While Jeff Sessions says some Americans want religion banished from the public square, he lays out how the Department of Justice is defending religious freedom. Correspondent Jason Calvi joins us now. Good evening, Jason.
Good evening, Lauren. The Attorney General cites the Founding Fathers' defense of religious freedom. He says they understood that a republic can only survive with shared principles, and religion is a key foundation for those virtues.
Attorney General Jeff Sessions defends himself against hecklers.
As a fellow United Methodist, I call upon you to repent, to care for those in need, to remember that when you do not care for others, you are wounding the body of Christ.
Well, thank you for those remarks and attack, but I will just tell you we do our best every day.
Sessions then condemns Saturday's Pittsburgh synagogue murders.
This was not just an attack on the Jewish faith. It was an attack on all people of faith. It was an attack on America's values of protecting those of faith. It cannot and will not be tolerated.
He lists some other recent threats to religious freedom, threats he says will not be tolerated. The Obama administration's legal fight with the Little Sisters of the Poor, a nominee questioned over her Catholic faith.
The dogma lives loudly within you, and that's of concern.
The Washington, D.C. transit system rejecting the Archdiocese of Washington's Christmas ad, and Colorado punishing a Christian baker for refusing to make a cake for a same-sex couple's reception.
Why don't they just leave him alone? I mean, for goodness sakes, what is it that makes us think that we have to reach into a person's belief on a matter of this kind and place that individual in a confrontation with his government and his conscience?
Sessions asks his Religious Liberty Task Force to investigate federal discrimination against religious entities. Now, in one very famous case, the Little Sisters of the Poor are being sued by several states, even though they won several times at the Supreme Court. Several states are still fighting them over the Obama administration's contraceptive mandate. Lauren?
Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi. Thank you, Jason. And now my commentary on the brutal killings of 11 members of the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh this weekend. My heart aches for all of those affected and for all who have gone before them, who have died practicing their faith. Most of my family lives in Pittsburgh. I've walked by the synagogue. My mother is a professor nearby. The many centuries of anti-Semitism are well known and form the backdrop for this horrible attack that occurred on the Jewish Sabbath. The hate-filled actions of those who persecute Jews, Christians, Muslims, and all believers must end. On our broadcast, one of our main goals is to educate the world about the atrocities that occur not just in the U.S., but around the world. It's why a team of us went to Iraq. It's one of the reasons why we cover the State Department, the White House, and Capitol Hill, to tell the stories of religious injustice and to be part of the solution. Vice President Pence told me that our broadcast's coverage has helped change policy. We, me, you, are not powerless over evil. Every act of kindness matters. My prayer, and I hope yours too, is that peace prevails and hatred fails. For all of us here at EWTN News Nightly, to all of you around the world, thank you for watching. We leave you tonight as we pray for the 11 victims of Saturday's synagogue attack. Good night, and God bless you.